session, we're going to be taking a look at ways in which Christianity in the colonies was very diverse as we get close to the end of the 18th century and as we get close to the Revolutionary War. But in some respects, we'll also see ways in which Christianity wasn't diverse, that there was a lot of similarity, and think about some of the things that means, as well as talk about where church membership was towards the end of the 18th century. And so that's kind of where we're going in this session. In many respects, Christianity was not that diverse in the colonies. One of the things that becomes important for a lot of people thinking about the history of the United States from the colonial period to the present is thinking about the amount of diversity that we have and celebrating that diversity. And to some extent, that's important that we recognize there has been a great diversity in the history of the United States and even in the history of Christianity and the history of religion in the United States. And so we don't want to overlook any of that. But sometimes we also need to recognize the ways in which there was, at various times, some uniformity, especially when we're thinking about predominantly the colonial Christianity that existed in the United States. Certainly, we've touched on some places already where there was some diversity, but I think that as well, it's important for us to keep in mind the ways in which there wasn't a lot of diversity. One scholar has referred to the colonies as being a mosaic of Christian faiths. And that's important for us to recognize that while there were certainly Native Americans in the colonial part of the United States as well as elsewhere, while enslaved Africans did have some traditional holdovers. There were some Muslims. In many respects, and there, I don't want to forget there were Jews as well, but very, very small population of Jews. But largely, the English colonies were made up of Christian faiths. Now, yes, in a sense, they are a mosaic in that there is diversity between Presbyterianism, the Baptists, the Methodists, Congregationalists, Anglicans, etc. And so we kind of have this mosaic, as you think of a mosaic being the different colored pieces that are put together to create a picture. So there is that aspect. Certainly there were regional differences. In New England, predominantly it was the Congregationalists that were prevalent. In the South. It was the Anglicans. There was differences among even those groups. So yes, there were differences, but in spite of this diversity, there is a unity that exists that we don't want to overlook. In the colonies, particularly colonial Europeans, particularly Anglo or English colonies, which are kind of the mainstream here for where the United States come from, 95% of those were Protestant at this time. A very small group of Catholics. So, in a sense, if we look at it this way, we see, wow, there's really not that much diversity, 95% Protestant. And out of those Protestants, 90% of those Protestants were Calvinists. All right, and so if you think back to the Reformation, there's the Lutheran stream, there's the Calvinist stream, there's the Anglican stream, there are a couple other streams. There are different expressions of Protestantism, but 90% of those that were Protestant were Calvinist. And out of that, 85% of those were English-speaking Calvinist Protestants. So we kind of have to find this balance between understanding the diversity, and we'll talk more about the diversity here in a little bit, but then also recognizing the unity, the similarities that were existing in the colonies especially when we think about Christianity and the large number of English-speaking Calvinist Protestants that existed in the colonial period. Now, certainly when we get into the 18th century, that diversity will explode so that those numbers aren't reflective as much. And when we talk about 19th century Catholicism, we'll see a large group of Catholics immigrate to the United States. They come with various views on Catholicism. There'll be new Christian movements develop. So there'll be all sorts of things that we'll see in which there is this great diversity that really becomes a part of the religiosity, the Christianity of the United States as it becomes the United States. Having said that, let's talk, though, about some of the diversity that existed in this time period, especially when we're thinking about the 18th century. Prior to the 18th century, prior to the 1700s, there were basically two denominations that existed in the colonies, the English colonies. One were the Congregationalists. Now, the Congregationalists, this is the Puritans. And in New England, the Congregational Church was the church that predominated, was the established church, right? Kind of the colonial state church. And that was predominant throughout, throughout this time period, up until 1690. And so there were certainly other people in New England that weren't Congregationalists. We talked about Roger Williams, for example. There were Quakers and others, but predominantly it was basically in New England, the Congregationalist church. In the South, it was the Church of England. And predominantly, you look at, Virginia, and it was predominating throughout that. Some other places, you did have, like the Baptist Methodists did have some presence, not so much the Methodists, excuse me. Wouldn't have been the Methodists because the Methodist Church didn't exist until the 18th century. But there would have been a few minor non-Anglican churches, but for the most part, it was basically the Anglican Church, and that was the official state church. We see something different when we look at the numbers when we get to the closer to the Revolution, so that late 18th century. 20% of the churches were Congregationalist churches, so that's still a sizable group. 15% were Anglican. Right? So those two main denominations still have, they're still pretty close in size, but what's happened is quite a bit of difference. So, for example, close to the Revolution, 18% of the churches are Scottish or Scots-Irish Presbyterian, right? So Scottish Presbyterian or Scots-Irish Presbyterian. That's a sizable group, and a lot of that has to do with some immigration that's taken place in the 18th century. But there are more Scots-Irish Presbyterians than there are Anglicans. There's also a large group of English and Welsh Baptists. And so, again, here are these two groups, maybe three groups if you kind of distinguish between Scottish Presbyterian and Scots-Irish Presbyterian. And there's some reason you might want to do that. But, that's a sizable change that's taking place. About 5 to 10% are Quakers, German Lutherans, German Reformed, right? So it's still that kind of Protestant group. And then you have a mixture of some other groups, small number of Catholics, etc. So there's been such a swing here in this development of, what types of Christianity exist in the English colonies. And the biggest place where we see this diversity taking place is in what are often called the middle colonies, right? So you have New England, you have the South, and then those middle colonies, which would be places like New York, Pennsylvania, Maryland to some extent, sometimes Virginia, Delaware, but these are predominantly what we're talking about with the middle colonies. Here's just a listing of the various denominations that were present in those places. About 20% of them were Presbyterians, right? So pretty sizable group are Presbyterians. There are German Lutherans, German Reformed. There are Quakers in the middle colonies. There's the Dutch Reformed Church, predominantly in New York. For some time, New York had been taken over by the from the Dutch. There are Anglicans. If we go even further, I mean, now not all of these are equally representative, right? There's various percentages of this. So there are fewer Anglicans in some of these colonies than there are in, for example, Virginia. You have Mennonites, very similar group to the Amish. The Amish and the Mennonites kind of split off from each other. You have a group known as the Moravians, one of those pietist groups. We briefly mentioned pietism in a previous lecture. Catholics, of course, in Maryland, but in a few other places as well where there was some religious freedom. German Baptists, English Methodists. I mean, there's all sorts of examples here of these various groups that are present in the middle colonies, and just showing you that it is a mosaic, right? You have these different groups that all have slightly different understandings of Christianity, different approaches to Christianity. For example, the Mennonites taking a very separatist approach, right? Separating from society. The Amish even more extreme than the Mennonites, where the Anglicans, the Methodists would be less likely, for example, to be as separatist from culture. Why were there so many? Why was there so many differences, or thinking about these differences in Protestantism? Well, you certainly have ethnic differences that are a part of this, right? And we talked about, right? You have German Lutherans, you have German Reformed, and Reform is coming from that Calvinist strain. You have Dutch Reformed. So as these different groups are coming to the United States or to the colonies, one of the reasons there's so much diversity is this ethnic diversity that's coming. But that's part of it. You also have some groups that are very sectarian, that are thinking about the ways in which they have, like, we're trying to restore the true church, like the Puritans did. And so there were some groups that had this sectarianism that also was reflected in theological controversy. There were some groups that were more open to theological controversy. And so when we think about this colonial diversity, it's the result of varieties of controversies that have taken place from the time period of the Reformation to the present. Well, not the present then, the colonial period. So that's a challenge here to thinking about the various differences that are taking place. And certainly there were people. Part of the reason we have some of these groups is that they are iconoclastic. They're breaking down, certain things. There's this rejection of certain views and this desire to kind of break off and form your own group, and that's that's part of the Protestant impulse that we've seen. Even though a lot of those early Protestants didn't particularly want that to take place, that was the way in which a lot of Protestants kind of thought about who they were and what they were doing. Additionally, when we think about some of the reasons for this diversity, we have to recognize that throughout the 18th century there were a variety of immigrant groups coming to the colonies, bringing with them their own religious groups, some of them more the ethnic aspects, like we briefly mentioned already. Some of them just coming with their own beliefs, and so that had a factor of this. As these groups come to the colonies, they might be small, but some of them began to expand. Especially if they were around in the 17th century, they were small, but in the 18th century, they start expanding. When you think about it, some of these groups that become popular were the ones that were revivalistic, tap into the awakenings in the middle of the 18th century. And while they were small at one point, they expand, they grow, they become much more prominent. And then also, we don't want to forget the ways in which there is this diversity is taking place because of the ways in which people are still holding on to some of those beliefs in magic, some of those beliefs in the occult, and they're mixing them with Christianity, and so that's kind of adding to this diversity as well. So in thinking about this expansion across the 18th century, particularly, the early to mid part of the 18th century, there were a couple of ways that people responded to this diversity that reflected political power, that reflected, the realities of a state church, as well as the realities of that diversity and what that did to the colonial system. There were some English colonies that required the oath of supremacy. Now, this is connected with the Church of England. And so some English colonies, where the Anglican Church especially was particularly in power, they required people to kind of swear these oaths in which they kind of committed to the supremacy of the Church of England. And essentially, if you were a dissenter, a nonconformist, right, non-Anglican, then you faced either, agreeing to this oath or moving from the colony, facing maybe persecution, facing other types of hardships. So some English colonies, really focused on trying to bring about conformity. In other colonies, there was a recognition that tolerating various religious groups could lead to economic prosperity. And so there were some colonial leadership, again, particularly in those middle colonies, that weren't, like a Pennsylvania or some, Maryland, where there was some religious freedom. They recognized that having those kind of diverse groups was a benefit to the colony, especially economically. Another factor as well that fits into all this is the Toleration Act of 1689, which we mentioned when we talked about the Glorious Revolution with the rise of William and Mary to the throne of England. And of course, this gives religious freedoms to any non-Anglican Protestants. And so that led to a flourishing in England as well as in England's colonies to diversity. We touched a little bit on that in the European backgrounds section. Having said that, there are some important things to recognize, though, about church membership as we get close to the Revolution. Right, so we're thinking here of, there's all this diversity. Christianity must be flourishing in the colonies because you have the Great Awakening, you have all these different religious groups coming, you have toleration. But really, as we get closer to the Revolution, we see that the awakenings of the middle 18th century had declined in frequency, and so had church membership. Now, often people have talked about the colonial period, especially in like American history textbooks or in ways people, especially Christians, think about the colonial period. And they've often kind of presented it as this time of great Christians who lived out their lives as godly people. Now, there's certainly some aspect of truth in that, but there are other factors to consider when thinking about how Christian the colonial period, especially the late 18th century, was. Between 1761 and 1800, one scholar wrote that a third of all first births in New England occurred after less than 9 months of marriage, despite harsh laws against fornication. Right? So there were laws on the books against premarital sex, yet a large number of births were less than 9 months after marriage. Now, certainly, there were some births that were premature, but certainly as well, some women didn't get pregnant. Right? So it's just one example of how a sizable group of people lived their lives in ways that didn't always fit in with Christian ideals. The same scholar also wrote that single women in New England during the colonial period were more likely to be sexually active than belong to a church. And I don't want to just focus on women. The same kind of thing could be said, and perhaps even more so, for men. So a lot of people were religious, but a lot of people didn't really belong to churches, and didn't often completely change their lives in response to that. There were small minorities in the colonies, like in Puritan New England, that kind of dominated public life. And the way which we think about these groups, we kind of think about them as this is the way it was, but it wasn't. There wasn't universal church membership. And so established churches, like the Congregationalist Church, the Anglican Church, would often inflate their numbers because they were receiving taxes from everyone in the area, so they counted them as members whether they attended or not, because they received taxes from them. But very few colonists were church members. Some sociologists estimate that around 17% of colonists were church members. 17%. Now, the number attending church services was higher. Sometimes it's estimated to be in the 80s. But in many places, that's required by law. And so ultimately, the number of church adherents or church members was low. Why was it? Why was it that membership, attendance was so low? I mean, certainly membership a lot lower than attendance, but why is it so low during this time period, especially when we think about it as being this great religious period? Well, one of the reasons scholars have pointed to is that many colonies at this time were still frontier-like. Right? There's not this great population present. The population is spread out. There's lots of people moving around. In that, there's not a lot of order or institutions, right? And so there's not a lot of churches. There's not a lot of government in some places, any sort of, like town government. And so that's part of that. In many cases, there were much greater numbers of men than women, which often led to lower membership numbers in places. It's been true from the earliest time periods that women are more likely to be church members than men. And so, in those areas where there were high populations of men and low populations of women, there were much fewer church members. There were few members, few ministers in the colonies. In some places, in other places, the higher numbers, and so they're kind of um, uh, grouped in some of these colonies. Some colonies had much more ministers than others, and sometimes quite a bit of those, many of those ministers um, were often lax, ineffective. The salaries for ministers at this time through the colonial period were provided by the colony, right, rather than the members. So you could be a minister, your church is low in membership, but you're still getting paid pretty well by the colonial government. So unfortunately, for some ministers, there wasn't as much of an encouragement or a desire to be about their duties, and so the responsibilities. So they ended up neglecting them, right? And especially in connecting with people in the community, in connecting with people in the congregation, encouraging membership in churches. There were some ministers, and unfortunately probably more than there weren't, who were just very lax and neglectful of their ministries. Affluence of the general colonial culture, but of ministers especially. And the more affluent a community is, the less likely it is to be religious. That doesn't mean that all affluent people are going to be irreligious, but it does mean that that tends to be the case. And so with culture being more affluent, with ministers being more affluent, because of the being paid by the state, the government, there just isn't that impulse to be religious, to be Christian. And then also the clergy throughout the 18th century are becoming much more secular. In some of the places like Harvard and Yale, which at this time are predominantly educating ministers, there are people that are becoming more doubtful about the supernatural, largely because of the Enlightenment, and we'll talk more about that in a later lecture. And so that's leading to the clergy being more secular. Right? And so they're not as emphasizing as much belief in God, belief in Jesus as the Son of God, and other things that are supernaturally connected. They still believe in the importance of religion. They still believe in God. They still believe in afterlife. But there just isn't as much of a supernatural connection because the clergy is becoming much more secular. And so these developments help us understand why we see such a low number of church members towards the revolution. Now, certainly after the revolution, we'll see quite a bit of difference as that takes place, particularly with the development of the Second Great Awakening. And so that will become an important change post-revolution that really leads the church membership numbers to change. And so I think this gives us a good picture prior to the revolution of what Christianity was like. In some ways it's diverse, in some ways it's similar, but as we get closer to the 18th century, despite the awakenings of the middle part of the 18th century, we're seeing Christianity in decline. We're seeing attendance, but we're not seeing adherence. And again, a lot of that is going to change after the revolution.